Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Curious Neuron Podcast. And as promised, I'm here with Erin. Welcome, Erin.
Thanks so much for having me.
I am beyond excited that we are having this conversation. It is a long time in the making. I've been following your work for a very long time. And it's about time that you're here on the podcast. I know everybody will be just as excited as I am about your work. I gave the bio at the beginning, but I'd love to know, I'm always curious to know how somebody makes their way through their research and academic career to what they are studying now. So what did that journey look like for you?
I love that question. Well, I was a psychology major in college and loved psychology, but also was volunteering at a preschool at the time and loved the idea of working with young children in that capacity as well. So I went back, got my master's in teaching, taught for a little while, went back, got a master's in school psychology. So I started to think about, I want to work more individually, one-on-one with children. That got me into research, which led me to PhD, which sort of combined then two of my interests, which was sort of seeing children in the classroom and how they interact with their teachers, and then also, seeing how they interact with their parents and thinking about how those relationships really impact everything, really, right? Their social emotional development, their cognitive development. And then I've been an academic since 2005. So
Right. And here we are. I love it.
and here we are.
It's interesting because very often the path isn't a direct linear path, right? And there's whether it's our curiosity or something that we're interested in that kind of guides the shifting of where our career goes and how we get there. And I love hearing that.
It's so true. I mean, I probably could have gone even like further, investigating other things, but my husband was like, and now you are going to work.
I get it. You can't be a student forever, but it's fine.
Really fun.
I do like it. Yeah. It's so good. You described what we're going to talk about today. And I've never really looked at it this way in the podcast. And so understanding the mother-child relationship, I think just saying that, I know that some moms that are listening right away feel immediate pressure when we talk about that. And I know because through the parents that I've had conversations with, it feels like there's a lot, on us and our shoulders in terms of making sure that we build a strong attachment, and some mothers struggle with postpartum and wonder like, what's this doing how is this impacting my child? So I guess on a general overview, and then we can dig a little deeper, what do you mean when you say mother-child relationship, and what have you found that is something really important for moms to know about?
Yeah, definitely. So I've looked at it mostly through an attachment lens. So really thinking about, how do we form these secure attachments that, we know are sort of most beneficial for children in the long run. And I think one sort of factoid that people can rest assured about is that the majority of children develop secure attachments. So, I think we worry so much about every little thing we do as a mom and as a dad. But, it's really this generalized, sensitive, responsive environment that you provide for your child that's really what matters in the long run. And that can look different with different children, and it can look different with different parents. And, the important things are things like joint attention when the children are little, right? So that you're both sort of showing that you're interested in what your child's interested in and that you're attending to them. It doesn't mean you have to be attending to them 24/7.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Like free play is so important for children and independent play. And I think sometimes we're really hard on ourselves as parents because we feel like we have to be engaging all the time and in some perfect way. And that's really not what the research shows us, is that it's really this generalized environment that we provide for them.
I do feel that some parents, especially new parents, and maybe social media plays an impact in this in terms of like, we're going to get into that in terms of some of the misconceptions. But I do think that sometimes they see it as an all or none. And I love that you just said all this because there's a lot of gray space, right? Of like, there'll be days where you're not well, and that's okay if you can't attend to your child the same way. But it's an average, right?
Totally. And I think that is so important for parents to hear because I agree. I think social media plays into so much anxiety around parenting because there's this idea of, oh yeah, I mean, so there's like a perfect way, right? There's a perfect way, and that we all want our children to like have a nice life, right? And sort of avoid bumps in the road, which there are going to be bumps no matter what we do, unfortunately, for them. And just it puts a lot of pressure on parents, I think, especially of young children.
And I think around attachment, I've seen so many misconceptions pop up, and, whether it's in comments or it's in posts as well, where I've seen parents um, kind of judging or getting upset at somebody because they're not baby wearing and saying, like, don't you care about your child's attachment? Not only have I seen like these comments, but I feel that sometimes there's a misunderstanding of what that looks like when your child is not with you. Right. And so, for example, there was a mom that I spoke with who was wondering why her child, who was starting daycare, couldn't leave her side. And she said, maybe I did something wrong when I was trying to build the attachment. But this is a 1-year-old child who's struggling to build that relationship with a new educator. What can you kind of say in terms of what we know in the research to comfort these moms that are having a child that's starting daycare or preschool?
Totally. Well, I think there are a couple different things. One is that, the same percentage of children are securely attached to have a parent at home who have a parent who has both parents or one parent working outside of the home, right? So using childcare is not harmful for the attachment.
Thank you for saying that. Great.
I think
I know that's a concern.
And it is. I mean, I went through it. I researched this, and with both my kids, I went through it. Right. So it's like,
Right.
it's so, these are your children. But then I think
Yeah.
too, like separation anxiety is part of a secure attachment too, right? So that's totally and utterly developmentally appropriate. I mean, we see it all the way through kindergarten for a young child to be reticent to go into a new environment, right? Even when we measure attachment, we don't measure what happens in the separation. It's during the reunion, right? That the child is like comfortable and happy to see the parent, the caregiver. We expect them to be, which is so sad, but we expect them to have a hard time separating. So also that, but then there's a lot of research too showing the benefits of the teacher-child relationship for the child in the long run. So having, just like children form attachment relationships with their parents, their caregivers, they do with their teachers as well. And those attachment relationships we found are also predictive of things like social emotional development, of achievement, sort of in the long run. I thought what was interesting is what we found in one study was children who actually kind of struggle a little bit with their attachment relationship with their primary caregiver. Those who had a secure, strong relationship with their teachers did so much better. So it even can act as a buffer and a sort of an additive in a way, right? The research suggests.
I know that parents that are listening are wondering, so how do I know? How do I know there's anything wrong? And I don't want to go into that right away, or maybe I don't know. I don't want to worry them, but what happens when you do have either a very young child going to daycare or a child starting kindergarten that is crying, not letting go of your arm? I've seen it happen. I've experienced it as well. And you're like, what did I do wrong? What can a parent how can they change their mindset around this moment? Now we know that that's not saying anything about the attachment style. That is just a moment and separation anxiety that the child is experiencing. How can we support the child in that moment in a way that feels good for us?
I think that some of it is in that moment and some of it is sort of around that moment. So at home, talking about how much you like the teacher so that, they hear that, they know this is a safe adult. Talking about your own experience when you were little, like, oh, when I went to school, I loved my kindergarten teacher. I remember her, like, these are the things, or him, these are the things that we would do. And really sort of creating that idea of a safe space, even when you're not in that space. And then also you can, schools are different, right? How much they allow you to do some of these things. But
Yeah.
If you can sort of build in a little bit of extra time and that make that extra time a little less every day. So, I'm going to stay with you in the classroom for 3 minutes or whatever, and 2 minutes, then 1 minute, and sort of the gradual release model of allowing your child to see you in the classroom, but then shorten that time. But some schools won't allow that. And, that's understandable as well. And I think in those cases, it's even more important to create that sort of mental image for children of this safe, warm environment that they're going into by talking about it over dinner or, talking about it on the way to school. Also, talking about what's going to happen at school can help a lot. Like if you know the child's schedule, if you can ask the teachers for their schedule and say, this is what's going to happen. This is who's going to pick you up. especially if, maybe you have a couple different, you have a caregiver one day, you're doing it one day. It can be a little bit, just confusing for a young child if they don't know who's picking them up. So sort of walking them through pickup, reassuring them that somebody's going to be at pickup, can really sort of help with some of that anxiety.
I do wish that more daycares or schools had the possibility of this gradual release model, because I do feel that it's comforting for the child. I've heard daycare educators tell me that they don't do that because it makes it worse and they don't have the time, right? And so we have to be mindful of what that looks like within the classroom. But during the pandemic, some daycares had reached out and said, like, how do we used to do that. We used to have this model. Now we can't. We don't have the ability to do that. And so I would recommend, printing a picture of the teacher, or just going to outside and meeting the teacher, the educator, and taking a picture with them and putting that on the fridge, just because it aligns with what you said in terms of, let's bring this person to our daily conversation so that they're not a complete stranger when we show up the first day. I was hoping, I just wish that there were more ways to create that sort of model in any way possible, right? Knowing that not everybody can do it completely, but doing it in a little way that makes it easier for that child.
Totally. And I mean, I think another way too, and schools differ with this as well, but I think, even if your school doesn't reach out and ask for information about your child, you can still email the teachers and say,
Right.
what they like. This is, sort of so that they maybe can bring in a little bit of sort of knowledge about the child into the classroom and say, oh, I know you love cats, and makes the child feel more comfortable, right? Like they already know them a little bit.
Right. I like that. Yeah, that is so good. You had mentioned two words that I know is not something that all parents would know what that means. And it's being sensitive and responsive. And I know that this is very important. There's so much research around that, but I know that not all parents understand that, because once I posted about this and somebody asked me, what does that look like? So what does it look like to be sensitive and responsive? Does it mean that we're making sure that we're not allowing our child to have any of these uncomfortable emotions? Are we, kind of buffering any outside, situations that might cause that? And are we not setting boundaries because that upsets them? So what does it mean when you say sensitive and responsive? Maybe if you have an example or two in a situation.
Sure. So I think, it's sitting with them in the difficult feelings. It's not preventing the difficult feelings from happening. So it's, attending to how they feel, right? So when we say, sensitive and responsive, especially around maybe when your child's unhappy about something, it's not saying, oh, it'll be okay. I mean, it's not like that's the end of the world if you say that, but ideally, right?
Yeah.
You sort of, I know you're really sad right now. Let's talk a little bit about like why you're sad, how we can, work this situation around. Like, let's say they're having trouble with a friend, say, okay, well, let's I understand you're really sad that so-and-so said they weren't going to be your friend anymore. Let's think about why they said that. We realize that that's not what's going to happen. They're still your friend. It was something they said in the quote unquote heat of the moment, and just talking through with your child, sort of what's going on. In terms of boundary setting, I mean, I think that's a real big misconception, is that setting boundaries is somehow bad for the attachment relationship, where in reality, like children are pushing, right, to sort of see like they want some boundaries that makes them feel safe and secure. Like somebody is taking care of them and recognizing like that's not safe to do. And they
might not be happy about it in the moment.
Exactly.
But they need it. They really do need it and want it.
Exactly. And I think that goes like the whole like developmental spectrum, right? Like I have a 4-year-old and a 15-year-old, and the boundaries are different, right, with both of them. But like my 15-year-old sometimes will say, thanks for not letting me do that. Not in the moment. Like not in the moment. She wants to go to that part. Yeah. Like in the moment,
right.
Like, oh,
yeah. Right. I get it. And it's the same for a child. I was talking to a parent this week actually who said sometimes there's a moment, and she has 3 kids and you're having fun, and then one child crosses the line or doesn't follow a rule or instruction that you said, right? Like don't go in that, I don't know, don't jump in the mud puddle, whatever it is. And they do it. And the parents said that they feel guilty because now getting upset or setting that boundary or saying, that's it, we're done. I asked you 3 times and now you didn't follow through. I need to follow through with this boundary. They felt that they were breaking the fun moment. And so that parent in particular just kind of always went in the opposite direction. Why set a boundary and end this moment where we're all having fun? And I think there's, part of what you're talking about in terms of being there with their child during uncomfortable emotions and setting the clear boundary. Many of us didn't experience that. We didn't experience, growing up, a parent sitting with us. It was during, these uncomfortable emotions. It was get over it. Or one parent told me about like happy up. This was like just get past that moment and you're done. Or there's nothing to be afraid of. Stop being so nervous or worried about stuff. And then in terms of boundaries, we struggle with setting boundaries because we weren't given that kind of freedom to set a boundary when we were young. So how much does a parent's childhood kind of play into this and their ability to be able to do this?
Oh, definitely. I think, by default, right? You go back, especially when you're stressed, right? You go back to like what you know. It's stressful when your child's upset. It's stressful when your child's like breaking a boundary. So I think our natural inclination is to go back to how we were raised, right? Because that's what we know. So really sort of, I think being cognizant of the fact that like, for better, I think research has sort of, showing us that there are some benefits to these things like setting boundaries and sitting with children in uncomfortable, moments that we just didn't have back then. And because we didn't have that research back then, the advice was not very different, but it was different, than it is now. And just, the little psychoanalyst in me. Things like that awareness is like so important because I mean, I notice it myself. I'm like, oh, it's fine, right? Just be like, wait, no, that's not what we're doing. We're going to sit here. We're going to work through it. But it plays into it a lot.
And you're just showing us, we're all human and we all have these moments. We don't expect any parent to be calm all the time. And can we just say that for 1 second? Because I think it's these like unrealistic expectations that we have of ourselves where, if you yell, then you have the guilt of, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Did I impact the attachment, or I'm having a rough week or month or whatever it is? And I think that these expectations make it really hard for us because then we have a moment that you and I have too. And then parents think that they've done something wrong. But to me, what you said, the most important part of this little section was you seem to pause and reflect and go back. And it's not too late. Once it happens, we can go back and repair.
Totally. I was just thinking that. I was like, repair. It's such a
Right.
important part of the relationship. Sometimes you strengthen the relationship, right? Even more through the repair after a less than ideal interaction.
Which will happen.
This will happen. And also I think, it's good for children to see that like we all have these emotions, right? Because like my little one sometimes, she gets so angry. She's 4 and she's, and I'm like, sometimes I feel like that too,
Yeah.
like you're not this perfect robot, that's like.
No, you're not. We're not robots. And I think I've said this before, but I feel like the pendulum has swung a little bit too much towards this being calm, and that calm is the ultimate goal. It's not, yes, we want to be regulated, but what's the difference? How would you describe the difference? Because I know that parents who are listening just feel like we need to be calm all the time. And that's suppressing emotions, which is also not good. And so what are we aiming for?
I think what you're saying is really like regulation. So understanding that you're going to feel it, like it's perfectly fine to feel every emotion. It's good to feel every emotion. Sometimes how we express it can be less than ideal.
Can work on,
right?
Yeah.
And talking about that. So, sort of when you have your moment when you're yelling at your kids and then later on say, I'm sorry I yelled. I was just really frustrated that whatever happened. Next time, hopefully I won't yell, but this time I couldn't keep it in. So that they understand that, sort of what regulation looks like and what maybe a little bit dysregulated looks like, and they can learn like the balance between them.
I get that. Yeah, we need to hear that. It's so important. Okay, so now I just want to touch a little bit on mental health or stress and anxiety, because I know that many parents are struggling right now, right? Even in the US, the Surgeon General said that parental stress is a public health concern. And so I think it's something we need to keep bringing back into the conversation, because it means that many parents that are listening to this feel that they might not fit within that, I can regulate myself and regulate my emotions and feel that I can connect with my child and be responsive when I'm struggling to do that with myself and my own needs. And so, what can a parent do if they're in that situation where they're struggling so much? And you even mentioned the stress part, right? When we're stressed, we're not reacting, we're not responding in the way that we should, we are reacting. And so, if a parent is listening to this saying, that's great, but I'm really struggling right now, what can they do to nurture their needs while keeping in mind their child's needs as well?
No, I think that's such a good question. And I think something that was interesting that kind of came out of the Surgeon General's report too is this loneliness that a lot of parents are feeling and this real need for community among parents. So I think sort of, at least for me, when I'm feeling sort of like down about parenting or life, my first instinct isn't to necessarily like seek out a community, but I think that actually can be one of the most supportive, not necessarily like an Instagram, like scroll, but like
No, not that. No, not the same.
not the same thing, but
Right.
some sort of community, whether it be, in person or virtual, where you're talking to other parents, because I think what can happen too is that, we're lonely. We're seeing all this stuff that, there's one way to raise a child. And if you sort of mess that up, then your child's going to be, have these horrible consequences. Right. And you're alone. You're, when you're not with your children, you're seeing this on Instagram, then you're with your children. And it's just, there's no time to sort of reflect and talk to other parents, be like, yeah, I lose my temper too. Like that's what happens. And really sort of being understanding of each other, I think can be helpful. So one, trying to find a community or even just one or two other people, right, that you can talk to honestly about parenting. And as much as you can, I feel like the self-care thing has gone also a little bit like,
oh yes,
too
thank you for
far.
saying that. Yeah, it's too much. It's consumption, and it's self-care is about like getting products. I don't know. It's a lot. It's very heavy, I find.
Totally. And I feel like then people feel guilty that they're not doing like self-care because
right. Yeah. Yeah. Why aren't you getting up at 5 o'clock and getting sunlight in your eyes and then
exactly.
That's another conversation. It's too much. I just feel that it creates a lot of pressure. You should be spending X amount of time on Sunday and prepping all your meals. And there's a lot of pressure I find on the parent for one, perfection, and self-care being perfect as well. And it's not. It's a ebb and flow kind of thing. Even for myself, like self-care might look like, oh, my internal dialogue today is not great. I need to kind of reconnect with myself and have that warm coffee that I've been waiting for. Right? Like it's moments. It's little moments.
Exactly. And I think some of that is finding those little moments can really help with your mental health overall. And also understanding it's okay to not feel great and that you can like sit with that and recognize that and then try to figure out those moments that are going to bring you a little bit more joy and relaxation. But I think being comfortable with being uncomfortable is also important because
which is hard.
It's so hard.
But important.
It's so hard. But I think otherwise it's hard to get out of that discomfort zone, right?
Yeah, it's true. And that community that you said comes into that, right? Like you can sit in that sort of emotion with somebody else that is just listening, not trying to fix the problem. We don't have to fix it right away. We also try to do that very quickly. And sometimes that takes away from just sitting with it and coping with it and then moving on from it. I think we want to push it away, but we were raised that way. Our generation struggles with that. What does it mean to sit with an uncomfortable emotion? I don't want to feel it. I want to push it away somehow, right? That's what we're used to doing.
Totally. I was just thinking that, like, I think so much of it comes back to how we were raised. And
right
now we're focusing so much on like sitting with our children, which is great. And in these uncomfortable moments, but we haven't really focused a lot on like ourselves and what we do in those
right. Exactly.
moments. So it's like all this pressure on us, right? To like help our children with their emotions, regulate our emotions. And
It's a lot. It's a lot for the parent. I get that. There are listeners that are dads and listeners that are single dads as well. And I want to be mindful of that because we've been talking about the mother child relationship. You mentioned dads at the beginning as well. Are there studies around that? I know that we, in general, look at the mother child relationships, but what if somebody's listening to this saying, one, maybe there isn't a relationship with the mom and I'm alone in this. How can I buffer? Are there like immediate consequences or, if they develop a secure attachment with me, is this buffering any of the other consequences, if there are?
Totally. So, I mean, the research is not as robust on dads, unfortunately, as moms, but the research that is out there, it's the same. So, sense of responsivity will lead to secure attachment. The secure attachment, in turn, supports children's social and emotional development. That is all. It's the same pattern with father-child and mother-child attachment relationships. And then for children who there have been some studies on divorce and things like that. And definitely a secure father-child relationship can buffer a child from, environmental stressors.
The adversity or environment. Right. I get that. Okay. I just needed to mention them. Now, as we're ending our conversation, but moving towards that, you mentioned the teacher child relationship. But what's interesting is there was one of your studies that I was reading and they talked about how it supports academics, like the academic performance. And so what have you found? Because I think this is interesting. There was, I believe it was in one of your studies that looked at classroom size. And here in Montreal last year, there were teacher strikes that lasted quite a while because they're trying to reduce the classroom size, among the other things that are causing higher, rates of burnout in teachers. But classroom size is one of them. I need to bring this up because we are not talking about this enough. And what I understand is that there's an impact on how this will influence the teacher-child relationship because there are a lot of students in the classroom. And then that, from what I understand, impacts their academic performance. Is this what you've been seeing?
It is. So, I mean, I think sometimes I joke, I'm like, sometimes I feel like my research just shows the obvious, but
but sometimes they need the studies to say, listen, look at this research. We need to change. But so the research is there, but we're not seeing that translate into changing how classrooms are structured.
It's so upsetting because,
Right.
It totally makes sense, right? It's harder to form a secure attachment
Exactly.
relationship with when your teacher doesn't know you as well, or when they're stressed and there's, a lot of environmental sort of stressors around with, just more children in the classroom, right?
Right. Which makes sense.
But what we found was that, close teacher-child relationship, we kind of looked at conflict and closeness, it sort of is a proxy for attachment in a way. And what we found was that close teacher-child relationships, all the way through, we looked through third grade at them, sort of predicting later outcomes, predicted, math achievement, reading achievement, cognitive, in the earlier years, cognitive skills. So, again, like sort of saying, no, research sort of shows the obvious, but what we found was that sort of the mechanisms or the ways that through which the relationship impacted these outcomes were things like student engagement, right? So the students were more engaged when they had a close relationship with their teacher. They were more willing to participate. So, you think about from an attachment lens, right? They feel secure with that teacher. They're willing to take a risk and answer a question, even if they're not sure they know the answer. So I think, the class size thing is so important. Because it really does impact the relationship. And the relationship we know matters all the way through, especially in the early years, but in the later years as well. And having a strong relationship with your teacher in the early years can buffer the negative impacts of having a not so great relationship with a teacher in the later years. So,
wow,
it's important.
It's important. And then it comes back to how I started this whole conversation, which is the stress on the person, the adult that's trying to build this relationship, right? So coming back to everything we just spoke about between the mom and child relationship, the same applies to the teacher-child relationship in the sense that teachers are stressed, they're burnt out, and now we're saying you need to build a strong relationship with your child. Does that look, so first, does this look the same as what we described with the parent, meaning that there has to be some sensitivity and responsiveness towards the child, or is there more when it comes to a teacher?
So I think it's the same principles, right? The sensitivity and responsivity. But what's trickier, right, is finding when you have 15 different personalities and 15 different, sort of ways of approaching the world in your room. It's figuring out sort of like, especially for the shy child. So I've also done some research on temperament and teacher-child relationships, sort of figuring out how, based on temperament, to be sensitive and responsive. So, you know, a shy child might need some support. It's like, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to call on you. Do you want to practice the response so that, you don't feel anxious in the moment, right? Like it involves also helping a child navigate in the moment, all these social interactions. And that can be a little different than the parent-child relationship because it's one-on-one more. So it's really sort of figuring out, okay, how is this child comfortable in the social environment? How do I support them in the social environment? How to, really provide them with the skills to interact with their peers, to participate in the classroom, and do it in a way that, sort of supports them based on their temperament. So there's a lot
Right.
going on in both
Mm.
relationships. But I think in the teacher-child, because you have 14 other children or however many, unfortunately, sometimes
30.
25, 30 other
Yeah.
children.
Right. Yeah.
It's hard. It's really hard.
It's hard. And I had a conversation with a local teacher. So I give workshops in schools here. And she was saying how by the time she settles down the class, and, there were about 4 or 5 children that she struggled with in terms of their behavior. By the time she settled them down, there were about 10, 15 minutes left within that hour to teach what she needed to teach. And so I'm thinking of the pressure on that teacher saying, well, okay, now you have to settle down those kids and try to support them because they need more help. And then the other kids are waiting to be taught something. And now don't forget to nurture the relationship that you have with them. It's a lot, right? And like you said, these classrooms can be up to 25, 30 here locally anyways. Um, how can a teacher, how can a teacher that's hearing this, how can we give them a little bit of a peace of mind, in terms of, I think you just gave a really good example. Are there more examples that can support them and saying like, how can I build strong relationships given temperament, like you said?
I think it is. It's really tricky at the beginning of the year, especially to figure out sort of what each child needs. Again, I kind of go back to that parent-teacher communication, caregiver-teacher communication as being so important, right? So if you can find out a little bit about your students and what makes them tick at home, and especially a child who might be having some trouble regulating in the classroom, find out what folks are doing at home to support the child in that regulation, or if it seems like there's not as much support as there could be at home in terms of regulating, talk to them, the caregiver, about what you're doing in the classroom and see if they'll do the same thing at home so that there's some consistency and in the feedback that the child's getting, because that can be so confusing for children too, right? At school, they have to be.
They're different. Yeah.
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 So I think really
Yeah.
getting to know students. And I think, again, with all this, it's like the generalized pattern that you have, like even as a teacher, you're probably going to lose your temper a little bit or,
Yeah. Right.
and that's not going to ruin the relationship. Again, it comes back to this repair and I think
And have boundaries.
and having
sorry.
boundaries. Exactly.
Right. I'm in your head. But it's true because I do think that some teachers also feel the same way as a parent in the sense that if I have too many boundaries or these strict boundaries, I'm the strict teacher. And so I might not be able to build that relationship. But I think especially in early childhood, they are still looking for those boundaries. And that's what's helping them feel safe in that environment.
Definitely. I always go back to even my daughter, one of my daughter's schools, the kindergarten teacher that everyone wants is very boundaries. Like she sets very clear boundaries, and kids feel really safe in her classroom, I think, because she's warm and loving, but like, you don't, go to the bathroom without asking to.
Right. It's clear.
The boundary isn't just there.
Right.
It's there for a reason. And it's often a safety reason, which shows that you care, so having that discussion.
Right. I get that. That's really important too. Being clear, right, in terms of why it exists and why it's there. I love that. Now, one little kind of question around SEL, you've mentioned social emotional skills, and I just need to touch on the fact that you've highlighted the importance of consistency and having it both in the school and at home, because I did speak to an SEL consultant in the States 2 years ago, where she said that they struggled a lot during the pandemic when they were trying to bring these SEL programs into the home, that parents were struggling, I guess, with applying this within their home. And I know that it could be a little bit more chaotic, and there's a lot more. They feel like it's something extra that they have to do, but it's important. And I just want to reiterate that in a different way, that there needs to be some consistency both in the classroom and inside the home, because the home environment matters a lot when it comes to a child's SEL skills, from what I understand.
Definitely. I mean, both home and school matter so much. And it's very, especially for a young child, I think it's very confusing if you're kind of, you know, told how to regulate or, showing how to regulate one way at school and a different way at home. And, you know, you talk about your emotions at school and you work through them, but then at home you're told, oh, everything's fine.
Right.
It just doesn't. And I think what the research shows too is that when you don't have some consistency between what goes on at school and what goes on at home, that the school-based programs aren't as effective. So that's something also to think about.
Right. Got it. One last little question, because there was a study that talked about parental accommodation, and I thought it was really interesting and something that we might not have heard about. And it said that the literature was linking parental anxiety, depression, and stress to increased accommodation behaviors. What does that mean? I just want to bring that up because maybe we're doing that without realizing. And I thought this was something interesting to bring up. What are these accommodation behaviors? And is it that we're letting our kids do things and we're not setting the boundary?
Yes, I think so. I think it's that. I think it goes back to again how we were raised and the stress that we feel, in the moments that you want to just okay, you know what? So my child won't be upset. I'm just gonna accommodate so that they will not be upset. And then often that also leads to neglecting maybe something that you need to do so that you're calming your child. Maybe you need to go to the pharmacy and get something, but your child's having a complete, meltdown or whatever. And you're like, you know what? I won't go. But you actually need something that you're not getting that's going to stress you out also. So I think, yes, that's really sort of the root of it is that this, fear of having your child be uncomfortable.
Okay. And that we should be avoiding this as much as possible.
Ideally avoid it.
Right. But it is true that it just takes a lot more energy to support your child through that. And sometimes a parent just feels it's much easier to let it go. But then if we're noticing, what I'm hoping by bringing this up is that parents start to notice. I wanted to bring this up for awareness, right? Because if you are noticing that you do accommodate your child very often, it's going to be hard for them later on when there are no accommodations in the classroom or in real life.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I just felt the need to bring I'm going to post the studies that I mentioned for everyone listening. They will be in the show notes as always. A lot of people love to follow up on the research, and your research is fantastic. I want to make sure I give you a moment to talk about Cooper, and we talked about community and the importance of that, as well as Nested, if you're okay, if it's okay to bring that up.
Oh, thank you. Well, Cooper is sort of a virtual community of parents that meets once a month, the same group of parents with an expert in child development to talk about a topic that is developmentally appropriate for their age group of children, as well as provides one-on-one sessions if you want. I found a little bit surprising is there's a WhatsApp, and that is actually one of the most sort of pillars of community sort of in the group. But there's a WhatsApp that people are great about sort of chiming in, and it's moderated by myself and another psychologist. So, sort of that balance between just what product do you use for this versus, sort of my child tantrums. What should I do?
Do you have experts around sleep or support around that? Because I know parents are questioning that.
I do. Sleep is so important for everyone.
Okay, thank you.
And then I've just started Nested with my colleague Robin Newhouse, and our goal there is to, do research but not necessarily just within academia, but outside of academia as well, to have quote unquote bigger impact on some of these issues. So like right now we're doing a big study on parental mood and anxiety disorder and looking at, sort of the root causes and sort of how to support parents through this very challenging time for many. And it's, very common, but really using research to hopefully inform policy and practice more.
I absolutely love that. And that's how we connected originally. Both you and I really have the passion of sharing the science and making sure that more than 3 people read a science article that can have an impact on our society.
Yes, exactly.
There's so much out there and people and parents need to hear more about that research. So thank you for the work that you do. I will put the links to everything in the show notes so that people can access you and your work and social media as well. Thank you. Thank you, Erin.
Oh, thank you. I'm a huge fan of your work too.
Thank you.